Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today is the 1st of July. It's a new month, and we have a lot of frontline updates to get into today. We're going to begin with Zaporozhye, but a lot of the video will be focused on southern Donetsk yet again, including the Russians crossing over the border into Dhakni, a village within Dnipro Oblast, is the first full village captured in that region. We're also going to look at advances that occurred northeast of Pokrovsk, an actual advance mining the 23 square kilometers of territory, and we'll finish off by zooming in on Toretsk. I did want to talk about a lot of other topics, and I did record another version of this video a couple of minutes ago, but it's just not working, the file. And so I just need to re-record this and focus on the frontline updates. And hopefully tomorrow or in 2 days, I'll get into the other topics. So just to look at developments on the ground, over here you can see that the Russian forces were able to advance just south of the riverbank. It's referred to as the Yanchikrak River. This is from June 30th. It's a video of the drone units of the 241st Territorial Defense Brigade dropping grenades onto individual Russian soldiers as they were approaching the houses and the forested areas that are pretty close to the narrow portion of the river. So this is actually a really good potential outlet through which the Russian forces could cross over and begin really putting a lot of pressure onto the eastern flank of the agglomeration within the town itself. And so now it's just a question of how much of an offensive willingness the 2nd Battalion of the 247th Regiment, which is the air assault unit that was involved in this initial advance over the past 3 days, how much of an offensive willingness they really have to continue pushing, or whether they were just involved in really sensing an opportunity and pushing with positional advances. Now, to move on to the east, I want to look at the essentially Velika Novosilka sector, or what should currently be referred to as the southern Donetsk sector. And so in this region, you do have a lot of notable recent Russian advances. So in between Shevchenko and Vilna Pole, the Russian forces took over what amounts to 1.3 square kilometers of territory. This is largely an open area that was undefended, and now you have the road network basically connecting between them under full Russian control, which will give them the basis through which to begin attacking the next line of Ukrainian defenses. You could see part of it demarcated on the map in yellow. It spans vertically and it would connect over here to another small network of defenses. So all in all, it measures like 8 kilometers from north to south. And this is going to be the fallback line for the Ukrainians. It's not really based around any singular settlement, but there are a couple of dug in positions over here and obstacles that would drag out the fighting and prevent the Russians from arriving at the border between over here it's Donetsk to the east, and then to the west it's Dnipro, to the south Zaporozhye. So that would deny the Russians immediate access to Kamyshuvacha. And another just perennial issue at this point would be that a lot of these villages over here are simply not connected well. There are local routes connecting them, but they are far apart. The quality of the routes is pretty bad, and the quantity is also pretty scarce. And the villages themselves are also small in size, and so once you get a sort of foothold within them, it's pretty easy to assert control over a certain basement, establish control in that region, and then continually expand. We saw that a lot recently with Russian advances that we're going to get into later on in the video. And so there is that really lingering worry for the Ukrainian side located in this buffer region between these three regions. But when we look at the most significant portions of the front line over here, the ones that are receiving the most attention, the most deployment of forces, and the deepest advances, those would be just to the west of the Mokriali River. So over here, we have a Russian advance amounting to 11 square kilometers of territory. When it comes to the advance in kilometers, just looking vertically, it's an advance amounting to just around 3 kilometers. So it is notable because previously you did have a Ukrainian salient that was outstretched in its location, sandwiched in between Shevchenko and Vesele, and it acted as a forward location that prevented the Russians from focusing all of their efforts on pushing northwards towards an area like Mirny. But now, as a result of this recent Russian correction of the front line, and also this concurrent attack coming just out of Fedorivka from the west, you do have a potential to unify the garrisons that were involved in capturing Shevchenko and the ones that are currently stationed near Fedorivka, Vesele, Komar. And that sort of unity can be used to begin putting pressure onto Mirny directly. So it would start with this advance from Fedorivka, which amounts to nearly zero point 0.7 square kilometers, because that would render the Ukrainian positions sandwiched in between the two vectors of attack, one to the sort of east, one to the south, would render them superfluous, essentially. It would be impossible for the Ukrainians to defend in such a narrow area. And so then you have this corrected section of the front line that is only, if we're measuring it, about, what is this, about 4.5 kilometers away from Mirny from the south. And there would be a perfect route through an open area for the Russians to approach it from that southern flank, at the same time that you already have the Russian forces stationed in Kumar itself that will be pushing from the east. And so there is a potential to already begin to overrun the villages on the western side of the Mokriali River. And doing so would not necessarily be that difficult, because the Ukrainians did not have the anticipation that they'd be in the situation now where they would be defending along this part of the river and would have to put a lot of their defensive hopes into building up these really small hamlets. These are areas that are not conducive for long-term defensive activity. It's possible in certain instances. It wouldn't be the first time, but we do have examples of the way in which the Russians have been able to advance rapidly in this region. And obviously, rapid is always going to be in relative terms. We're talking about an area that's sort of like spanning 10 kilometers, and within that 10 kilometers, the advance is like relatively rapid. And so the capture of Zaporizhia, Yalta, and Zurka within the same week, those villages are really small in size. And not only are they small in size, but they were also on the eastern side of the riverbank. And so there was sort of an impetus for the Ukrainians to withdraw and not necessarily resist. And so the western bank is different in that regard, obviously, but it's not that different in the sense that you do have the river over here, but it is pretty narrow and wouldn't be that difficult for the Russians to cross over, establish a bridgehead across of, and already begin to insert themselves, make their presence of importance, and assert themselves into the northern houses in an area like Pidubny, for instance. And you're already seeing that the Russians are looking at fully getting rid of the salient over here, closing in on it entirely, with their advance north of Kamar amounting to 2.1 square kilometers, which also includes movement near Perobudova. So now you have this 4 kilometer span sort of acting as a width of a lid that's feeding access into the salient. And the Ukrainians over here, they are not large in quantity, but they are trying to drag out the fighting for as long as possible in order to prevent the Russians from really unifying between the northern flank where you have Zurka right now and then the one around Komar to the south. That's a part of it. And another objective is to just buy a bit more time for the Ukrainians to just reorganize their elements, their battalions, and their platoons that are based around this river line after having to withdraw what amounts to maybe 20 kilometers from their previous locations, whether they be in Andrivka or whether they be around Bakhtir. It is a really notable withdrawal westwards across a largely open area. And it's an area that they have to now defend without many trenches that will supplement them. So you look at Zurka, this is also an area where the Russians just arrived at the riverbank itself. So that amounted to nearly 50 hectares of territory. And now you zoom in over here and you can see that there were two advances right next to the Vavcha River, one south of the riverbank near Yalta and Zaporizhia, and it amounts to almost 1 square kilometer of territory captured in total. But then the more notable advance would be the full capture of Dhakni. Essentially, what happened is the 114th Motorized Rifle Brigade, they pushed from the east along this notable highway, this highway that it originates from Andrivka and even further eastwards. It crosses over Oleksivka, and so in all likelihood, the Russians also control this section of Oleksivka where the highway runs through, then into Zeleny Kut and Novokranka. And so the way had already been paved with the initial Russian breakthroughs that occurred that allowed them to even reach Dnipro Oblast and the border in the first place. So then they just capitalized on that. And in their most recent advance that occurred on, the 30th of June, they were able to advance along this one particular route. They had to fight and overrun Ukrainian defenses that were still active along the border, because you did have Ukrainian presence, including anti-tank ditches and in underground fortifications that run along the border and also are just north of it. So you did have engagement between FPV crews from the Russian side that were striking at entrances into these tunnels and into these sort of semi-underground dugouts. And then you also had small arms fire complementing that from the Russian side. And they were able to cause the Ukrainians to either retreat or just killed whatever small forces were still left resisting in these areas, because we're not talking about a large quantity of soldiers that were defending in this location. You're looking at small squads that were left behind and tried to, hold up the Russian advance. But after that point, Dhakni itself is relatively unguarded because of the river, which sort of acts as a natural barrier, but it was bypassed because you had that advance coming in from the east. So the Russians captured it really quickly. They made their presence known with the flag raising and all of that. What that means now is that the Russians have this linchpin, this organization point that is north of the Vovcha River. That's one bonus, and it's also within Dnipro Oblast. So that's important in terms of the sentimental value of capturing a village in a oblast that hitherto that point didn't have any major Russian presence. That's one part of it. But besides that fact, it also gives the Russians access to this highway that leads directly into Novopavlivka. In Novopavlivka, I would say that the Ukrainians lack the foresight to build up a sufficient amount of defenses around here. And it's possible that now, when we look at new satellite imagery, there will be more defenses around here. But look at the situation over here. You have the town Pavlivka, which, it acts as a forward base for artillery. It acts as a splitting off point for a lot of roads and logistic services. And so it's important that it be defended from all potential threats from several axes. And just naturally, you can't really blame anyone for this. It's surrounded by large swaths of open fields, which makes it conducive for deep armored penetrations, or not even just armored, but also using more light modes of transportation like motorcycles, private vehicles, ATVs, and buggies. So you're looking at an 8 kilometer span where you have the highway and you also just have large swaths of open fields that could be taken advantage of by Russian forces using Dhakni as the organization point. And at some point, it could also become Filia. And that's why building up defenses over here is so important, because it would just give that layer of density needed to obviously complement the drone crews that are going to be active around here. And I believe there are going to be a lot of drone compilations of Russian motorcyclists getting targeted as they advance northwards. But that's only going to do so much if there isn't some sort of physical aspect on the ground to keep the Russians at bay from actually arriving at the town. Because as much as the drone crews are useful and do lead to high casualty yields, it can't stop a full trickle. And eventually, some are going to be able to enter in and seep in, and then at that point, destabilize the front line. And it doesn't have to just occur from the south; it could also occur in a two-pronged attack from the east, because you also have a large span of territory running along the eastern flank of the town that is completely open, besides obviously the trench line in the Ditch that runs along the official border between Donetsk and Dnipro. That's one factor. And then you also have this sort of perimeter line that was built but doesn't appear to be fully complete in this recent imagery. So that has to be kept in mind. But there is the troop density needed, I believe, to defend in these regions. It's just the fact that there aren't really suitable options for frontline locations that can be used, can be made open for a large quantity of forces to deploy themselves, because you are looking largely at open areas that would leave Ukrainian forces very exposed if they were to deploy to them. And so for them, it's just safer to stay in basements in Novopavlivka. But then by extension, they're sort of neglecting the flanks. And the southern flank is now becoming the most sort of worrisome parts of that entire equation. But it's not the only part that's being sort of noticed at the moment, because you do have this localized counterattack by the Ukrainian side, amounting to zero point 0.8 square kilometers in territory. What happened here was the Ukrainians sent an M113 APC, and it dismounted its crew as it was getting pounded by fiber optic FPVs, multiple of them. And at some point, it was destroyed as a result of these strikes. And then the crew got out as it was about to get destroyed, and it was also targeted in a separate strike by the FPVs, meaning that we are not exactly sure if the Ukrainians do maintain a permanent presence over here, but just based on the sake that there was video, I will show that there was slight movement around here, indicating that the Ukrainians are willing to conduct these sort of positional movements, these localized attacks to just try to drag out the fighting, take back some sort of important position in the micro sense of the term, that can be used to sort of dominate the nearby fields and prevent the Russians from pushing a bit deeper towards the border itself. That would be the objective, I believe. At the same time, though, you have advances near the Solana River. The Nova Mykolaiv is largely under Russian control, but not fully. So on June 30th, you had the Russian flag raised in the village by the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade. You could see that over here, actually, and it's pretty close to the Solana River. So that's one town that's largely falling into Russian hands, and then Novoserhivka is fully under Russian control at this point. I suppose with the exception of this gray zone located on the western tip. We're looking at 1.2 square kilometers of territory that was captured in total. You're looking at an area that largely has open fields, a couple of houses, a couple of agricultural facilities, but it's so disconnected from the main Ukrainian bases of operation, whether it be Moldotsk over here and Novopidorodny, and then you're looking at the larger scale. You have Mezhova, and so the idea, the concept of the Ukrainians sending in forces through armored vehicles to deploy to this sort of forward bulge that's sort of sandwiched in between the pond and Novoserivka, that became more and more unlikely as time went on, and so the Russians just took advantage of that sort of natural disadvantage from a geographic standpoint that the Ukrainians had to suffer through in this area. And I believe it's largely the 59th Brigade, some of its subsidiary battalions, or the 32nd Brigade as well. And now they've been pushed out of that particular location. And the next step would be a unification between Novomykolaiv and Novoserhivka, including the full capture of the Solana River Valley. And then from there, it's going to be interesting because Muravka is a village that still remains under Ukrainian hands, and it's on the Donetsk side of the border. So then the question will be whether the sort of momentum that we saw around here will be used to sort of channel it into building up the northeastern flank for Novopavlivka, because that's certainly one step, or it can be used to sort of build up a base to cross over the border and then begin putting pressure south of Novopirorodny and Molodotsk itself. So there are two ways in which this recent Russian rejuvenation around here can really go. So that's it for the Dnipro part of the front line, I would say. And I want to zoom in for a moment on the Murad Pokrovsk front, because we do have two updates, and you could see that we're going to begin with this localized counterattack by the Ukrainians. They sent in another M113, and it was only one based on the footage. It got hit by the fiber optic FPV, and I believe it was disabled, although I don't think it was destroyed. And it was only one. And so, feasibly, what happened was you had the vehicle advancing along this local road, and it could have originated from an area to the west, like from Munirad itself, for instance. But at some point, they entered this local route, and from there, branched across the pond region, made it into the residential buildings of Mirilyubivka before being spotted and targeted by Russian drone crews. But this does also show us that there is a lack of complete rigidity around here, because the Ukrainians do still have the opportunity to send in armored vehicles, even a singular one, and achieve some sort of infiltration into the Russian line, showing that it's not as solid as it may have been imagined due to the river and the body of water sort of separating the Russian and Ukrainian lines. But again, it's not too far fetched for this to happen, because you're looking at distances that aren't that significant. You're looking at like 2 kilometer distances between a normal part of the Ukrainian front line and the Russian positions in the village. So my point is that we're gonna have to wait and see if there is footage confirming that the results of this attack have now been reversed and that the Russians are in full control of Mirulubivka. But certainly the village is of heightened importance, because it acts as a linchpin, as a forward operating base to begin attacks towards the Toretsk River Valley into areas like Mykolaiv, Novoekonomichny, and that's becoming an issue for several facets of the Ukraine's defense. First of all, these continued deep advances that we're going to talk about today, they're threatening the small Ukrainian squads situated in the salient over here east of Mykolaiv. Additionally, the control over Myrylyubivka provides an outlet to actually cross over the river and then from there cut off this large swath of open fields that sort of surrounds or just sort of hovers northwest of Hordivka itself. And as we were saying before, it also acts as a natural route feeding into populated areas like Mykolaiv, Novoekonomichny, although due to the recent Russian gains, amounting to 23 square kilometers, as we can see over here, it doesn't necessarily have to come from the south, those sort of attacks. It could also come directly from the east. So you can see a feasible attack coming from Mirny running along the T0504 to begin clearing out houses in these two villages directly, and then from there approach the eastern perimeter of Munirad. That's a possibility, although I believe it is unlikely because even though you don't have that many layers of trenches to deal with in this scenario, you're looking at areas that would be difficult to overrun. The Ukrainians don't have, I believe, that significant of a deficiency in manpower around here. I actually do believe that they do have the sufficient amount of boots on the ground to defend in these particular locations. When it comes to house house fighting, and it's going to be abetted by drone crews, obviously, and so it could turn into a sort of slogfest in some of these villages. But again, given the fact that the Russians did capture Myrilivka, I don't think it's obviously out of the realm of possibility that they capture these two villages. I'm just saying that there are other options that the Russians have at their disposal, which is positive for them because they have advanced along such a broad part of the front line that they actually do have options available to them. So you look at the capture of Kobjeve and more generally open fields around here. You're looking at probably a 50 square kilometer chunk of territory that I've been talking about incessantly for the past couple of months that I said it would fall into Russian hands in a similar fashion as we're seeing now. It's basically sandwiched in between a couple of road networks and also these trenches. And the Ukrainians they lacked sufficient defenses around here. And as a result, they ceded control over it in a short period of time. And it's a shame from a Ukrainian perspective because now it gives the Russians the needed opportunity to begin pushing into the sort of western bank of the Toretsk River directly and beginning to undermine the entire defensive network that was built around protecting the Pokrovsk Munirhad agglomeration. So we can see that when it comes to the maximum advance, it amounts to what is that, like 7 kilometers westward. So it is pretty deep. And they've basically arrived at the outskirts of a lot of these trenches. If not, they overran them already, which is also of particular concern because it means that some of these defenses can't really be fully utilized by the Ukrainian side to maximize the amount of time that it takes to overrun a certain piece of territory. So we've already seen this trench line overrun, and as a result, the Russians are at the gates of Razina, and it's a hamlet. It's small in size, so it should be easier to take over than two neighboring suburbs. And capturing such a hamlet would give the Russians an opportunity to cross over. They would have to fight through two layers that are pretty notable in size, this one over here and this one. But it would also give them the opportunity to cross over the riverbank in a narrow area through a village that is pretty small in size and establish their sort of bridgehead that serves the function of pushing deep into ridge lines, into locations that can be used as potential firing or vantage points that overlook the logistics into Pokrovsk itself. Because again, the overarching goal would be to cut off this road over here that connects between Dobropilya and Pokrovsk. Although for now, that's not within the short-term sort of diagnosis of the situation. But you can see that based on the current location of the Russian side, they are only about 8 kilometers away from Rodnitsk. They're about 9 kilometers, 9.5 kilometers away from the actual highway that's being used for supply. And so we will have to look at, first of all, the situation when it comes to fire control as the Russians get closer and what sort of systems are deploying near the front line, because they have now control over a large swath of open fields and ridges due to their capture of these plots of land, and obviously also Shevchenko, Persia, and Kopchev. That was done largely through small scale attacks. You're looking at just a couple of members of squads that were involved in these fights and in individual advances using buggies, ATVs, you know, motorcycles as well, private civilian vehicles, all of the above being utilized to varying degrees. And then whenever the need really presented itself, the Russians also had their disposal, but to a lesser degree than in previous years, they had access to armored vehicles. And so there was debate about to what degree it's rationing, to what degree it's tactical considerations, but certainly now they're refraining from using them regardless of the reason, and they've been shifting towards these lighter modes of transportation. But when the opportunity presents itself, and when you're looking at advances that amounts to around 8 kilometers or more, having access to armored vehicles like an MCLB, even though it's slower and bulkier than a motorcycle, it has less of a chance of getting destroyed during the course of the movement. And so at that point, it becomes preferable when you want to then dismount those forces, especially when you're looking at like groups of 8, 10 in some cases. So that would be the logic behind deploying them at this point, these armored vehicles. So that happened in this case, for instance. And now you have the opportunity from a Russian perspective to begin to cross over into the dense lines of trenches, beginning to cut them up before they can be used to sufficiently drag out the fighting. And so that will be on everybody's eyes over here. So certainly we will be continuing to report on it. Looking over here at Dhakni, I believe we're going to finish off with Toretsk. You can see that just north of the village, the Russians captured this small section of a salient amounting to 4 square kilometers of territory. When we look at the full extent of the advance, it amounts to what is 2.5 kilometers rather. So there do still remain sort of vestiges of salients that you can see stretched out over here, and they will be of particular concern for the Russian side as they try to reduce the fluidity along this part of the front line. The Russians would prefer a stable line where they have the ability to, use that to their advantage to push deeper, but not in a fluid way, because when we're looking at fluidity over here, you're talking about a large chunk of territory northwest of the city of Toretsk that is either completely open, there are some local routes, or there are some forested patches. And besides that, you don't really see armored vehicles anymore. You don't even see that many motorcycles. You do see some that get targeted, but it's mainly on foot. So you're seeing individual soldiers or soldiers in extremely small groups maneuvering through these areas and getting picked off by drones. And that's become the totality of the fighting around here without much of an exaggeration. And you could see actually footage from the 17th Special Purpose Center, which is a part of the National Police formation. They conducted FPV strikes onto Russian infantry just to the northwest of Toretsk in this point. And as they were approaching, in one of the pieces of footage, I believe it was the Novodzerzhinsky mine, as it's being referred to, where it's currently split between the Russian and Ukrainian side, but it acts as a really important projection of power on a local level to get a good vantage point and sort of use it as a secure location for your forces. So that's the current unfolding of events in Toretsk. And thank you all so much for watching. I did want to talk about the White House's announcement about a suspension of certain aid to Ukraine, or at least a pause for a certain period of time, and about the death of the commander of the 110th Mechanized Brigade in a Russian ballistic missile strike. His name is Serhiy Zakharichev or Zakharevich. And also looking at a just sort of monthly summary of the amount of territory captured by the Russian side this month, which would amount to 556 square kilometers of territory, the most since the 730 kilometers that was taken, square kilometers, obviously, in November. And so month over month, it's been generally going up throughout this year, and now it reached another sort of zenith for this 6 month period, and now we're moving into the 7th month in July. So thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.